everybody here? It's a few minutes before 11.
No, 10.
That's right, it's a few minutes before 10. God, I was hoping this was already over. Well, as you can tell, there are better dressed people in the world than less well dressed people, or something like that. And I am delighted that we have as a guest today Adam Guyette. Scott, who I don't think is here now, I hope he wanders over, head of security, knows you somehow. I'm not sure how.
I'm on one of the sub-associations for Sawgrass, the Control Access Committee, and I see Scott every month for that.
Controlling access.
Yes, and blocking speed bumps.
Will there be access to Oak Ridge here? Is that
Evidently, they
part
are
of your
doing
remit?
So yeah.
Boy, I hope so. If not, what are we going to do with that money we spent? Don't say anybody said that. I had lunch with Adam on Tuesday to get a feeling for him as a person and whether he'd fit in here, and I think he really will. So, by way of introduction, I'm going to start by just asking Adam, and I, by the way, have some questions, but I sent them to Adam in advance. I don't ask anything about whether he's still beating his wife, as you might expect. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure.
How did you become so active in politics and on the right?
I grew up in central New Jersey, East Brunswick, and like some people, all my life I wanted to be involved in politics, but I never had a clue how the heck to do it. And people always ask me, why did you care about politics when you were so young? But literally for me, my bedtime stories weren't Hansel and Gretel or the Three Little Pigs. They were my dad telling me about Reagan firing the air traffic controllers. You know, my heroes were Churchill and Reagan as I grew up. So I wanted to all my life express my beliefs politically, had no clue how the heck to do it. And I moved down to Florida in 1999 to attend the University of Florida and ended up on a congressional race in Northeast Florida in 2000. And like most Northerners, I thought the state began at Miami and ended at West Palm. Perhaps the rest might be occupied by Indians. We didn't even know there was a North Florida. But I was working on a congressional race where the district was from the Florida-Georgia border down to Daytona, just on the coast. And you spend enough time going up and down A1A, and you think, well, this isn't a bad area at all. So all I ever wanted to do in my life was advance my beliefs politically and ideally live in Northeast Florida. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to accomplish both of those things, although it means a lot of travel.
You mentioned at lunch that you and your father used to listen to radio sometimes.
Yeah, I literally would tape record Rush Limbaugh when I was in middle school and listen when I got home. And normally when I tell that to young people, they're really confused because they have no idea what a tape recorder is.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, that explains a lot. Let's switch to some policy questions. What do you think, and my next question is, what do you believe are the three, and it could be one to through whatever, the three most important issues facing the United States today?
For me personally, I've always been incredibly bothered by wasteful government spending, as if there's any other type. I personally am a very fiscal conservative. Ideologically, I'm a bit of a libertarian, and I think federal spending is incredibly out of control. We view government as this magic solution to any problem that ails us, and just because we've identified a problem doesn't mean that the federal government printing money or borrowing money that our grandchildren will have to pay back, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily the solution. And so the amount of money being spent currently is terrifying. It's money we don't have. And much of our debt is owned by China. So anytime the federal government spends $1, we just, in my mind, have to ask ourselves, well, is this worth borrowing money from China to spend on X? And to me, I mean, the answer is quite commonly no. So for me, the biggest issue is probably spending.
Okay.
The second issue would be cultural Marxism. The left, and I paint a broad brush when I say the left, but radical leftists, in my view, have been incredibly effective, dangerously effective, at taking over every bit of our culture, from higher education, which is now almost exclusively dominated by radical leftists, and they shut out any opposing viewpoint. Moderates are barely tolerated now, to mainstream media, which is, with the exception of Fox and talk radio, dominated by the left, to Hollywood, which is dominated by rabid left-wing viewpoints. Anytime you go to see a Hollywood movie, if you see a businessman step out on the screen, you know right away who the villain's going to be, right? What does that do to a culture when every fabric of our society is telling us that, businessmen and entrepreneurs are the bad guys? And we hear that so much again and again. So the fact that our culture has been so much taken over by extreme radicals at times is terrifying to me. And then separately, just the notion, and this kind of goes along with the first one, of people looking to the government to solve all of their problems. When you've got less people in civic groups and less people in church groups and less people active in their community, it means that instead of turning to those organizations for solutions to life's problems, people turn to the government. And I think the government is the least equipped to solve any problem. I think they're the biggest creator of problems in our society. So it's not that I would expect everyone to return to the rugged individualism of the founding of our country. We're not going to go hike the Oregon Trail. But the notion that we can reach out to government to solve all of our problems is a terrifying fallacy in my mind.
So, that's a lot. And I don't know exactly where to pick it apart, but I've got other questions, but first I want to ask us a little more about that. I'm going to do the second part first. This notion that the cultural leftists have so taken over our society, our educational program, everything, Hollywood, what was on television, except for a small handful of outlets on the right. Businessmen are not respected. How do you explain the fact that in the last 40 years, businessmen have increased their wealth by multiples of 20 or 30 or 40, that we now have more billionaires than we've ever had? We have 200 billionaires, people with $200 billion. If in fact businessmen are so derided, if our society is so opposed to them, how do you explain this enormous success?
Well, I think there's two ways you can explain it. First of all, we still have a relatively free market system, one of the freer markets the world has ever seen. We've had increased globalization, where businessmen can sell their products far more easily across the globe in ways they couldn't before. I might bemoan restrictions and regulations on markets, just as I might bemoan restrictions and regulations on speech. But due to the advent of the internet, we have much freer ability to share ideas and share products across the globe than was ever even imaginable just a few short decades ago. So I think that's a big cause of it. But then separately, it's important to remember now that so many businessmen have realized that the key to economic prosperity is to tie yourself to government. We have crony capitalists. We see them, here in Jacksonville with the Shah Khan types. You see it with Elon Musk, who I think is, equal parts genius and charlatan. Elon Musk does an incredible job making money off of our tax dollars. For a while, you saw General Electric plan all of the growth in the company based in areas in which they could be in the government sector. And as the government sector increases, the businessmen that are connected to politicians are going to be, provided with the best opportunities to make money. That terrifies me.
Again, there's so much there. Are all the successful businessmen then simply just on the government tit, and that's how we explain most of the wealth?
Certainly.
But it was good. And if we assume that a great number of those who are successful, we'll back up for a second. I think maybe there might be some area of agreement here. To the extent that the rich, wealthy people have made some of that or all of that wealth performing public tasks as opposed to private tasks. For example, and I don't know where you stand on this, private prisons. Is that an activity that should be performed by the government, or is it appropriate for that to be a private sector activity?
Prisons. It's so funny when we see the debate over private prisons, because I think it speaks to the typical argument, and it speaks to a different worldview that I think left-wingers and right-wingers have. Left-wingers judge government programs by their intentions, and right-wingers at least pride themselves and believe that they judge government programs based on their results. So a left-winger would say, well, we've got problems in these prisons. They're not particularly well run, per se. It's wasteful and these are bad conditions. These prisons must be improved. Thus, the solution is, let's get government involved. I just can't find anything that the government touches. They've got like the Midas touch, but rather than things turning to gold, they turn to excrement. The notion that government could step in, and if only politicians were running it, it would be so much better. Have we ever seen that occur in our society in one tiny bit? If anybody's traveled to the airport in the last 2 decades, we were told by Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid after 9/11 that we had to federalize all of the security workers at the airport. He said, you don't professionalize unless you federalize. And we federalized every single security screener in pretty much every airport in America. It's now the TSA. Would anybody make the case that as a result of the TSA being federalized, that security at airports has improved dramatically? Of course not. In all independent studies, something like 95% of weapons that try to sneak through security still get through. So if the government can maybe show that they can manage security in a 50-foot by 200-square-foot part of the airport, then I might be more convinced that they could effectively manage prisons. But until that point, I'm just not convinced.
And you prefer to have it privately run?
Yeah, I do, and that's not to say there's not problems in our prisons, because there certainly are. But generally a government solution is the government breaking your leg, giving you a crutch, and saying, if not for us, you couldn't walk. You know, I think some of the problems in overcrowding in prisons are because of our criminal justice system, not because they're run by private sector companies. And the desire for the left to have them take control over it and make them government-run prisons is merely a desire to get more people on the government dole, because the private sector union membership has declined dramatically in our lifetimes. Union memberships are exploding, however, in the government sector. And all of those employees, without fail, every 2 weeks, if you work for the government, a portion of your paycheck is taken out and given to the union. And every 2 years, without fail, that money is given to big government left-wing candidates. So for me, it's almost hard to believe and hard to pretend that things like government-run prisons and government-run, anything exist for that purpose when they don't do those tasks well. They don't manage security well. They don't manage schools well. What they do well is they collect union dues every 2 weeks without fail, and they give that money to left-wing politicians every 2 years without fail. These institutions exist essentially to embezzle tax dollars and use it to fund left-wing candidates more so than they do to educate children or to screen us at the airport and block weapons. So of course they want more people doing that. Prisons are an opportunity for them.
I hate to ask any other questions because the answers are so complete, Adam, and quite different from what I've been talking about for a year. It doesn't bother you at all that a private prison operator makes more money if beds are full and filled longer, and therefore let's have more prisoners with longer sentences? The incentive being to encourage the justice system to incarcerate more people?
Well, again, that comes down to what the politicians do. And if the politicians are, creating, horrible victimless crimes and locking people up for nonsense, and those politicians are getting donations from the private prison companies, perhaps we should make judgments on our own that, listen, this politician is heavily in bed with this private prison company. Perhaps that might be why he's advocating for, minimum sentences and 3 strikes you're out laws and things like that. As I said, it's not to say that private prisons are perfectly run and everything the government touches is terrible, although the latter half is probably true. But I do think that private prisons are unquestionably imperfect.
No government program ever has been successful and well run.
Maybe successful, not as much well run, I don't know. It'd be a hard time, I'd have a hard time thinking of really well run government programs. There are exceptions. I certainly like, what the military does. I'm very appreciative of national defense, but even we all see that so many times the military gets a weapon delivered to them that they don't even desire merely because there's a really powerful senator and they're going to build it in his state. Well, that's problematic. So, with that in mind, I think we would want to limit as much as possible government spending to things that we know they can do well and things that are absolutely essential.
But would you turn part of national security over to the private contractors?
We also use private contractors for a lot of things. We use Blackwater in Iraq.
Precisely the group I was thinking about.
Okay.
You asked them to do more than what they did in Iraq?
I think potentially at times. Every day we use outside contractors in Iraq. We've used them in Afghanistan for a variety of tasks because it's a lot of times far less expensive than using our military.
I'm going to ask I've got other questions to start with. Are there questions or comments from the floor? Doug, wait for Ken. Excellent so far.
Yeah, I've got a comment on the prison discussion. The government-run prisons are designed for punishment. The private prisons are designed for cost control. And there are differences in how the prisoners are treated in the two facilities. I'll give you one example. The telephone. Now, in a state-run, the state of Florida-run prison, the telephone is generally available, let's say, when for an extreme emergency. Let's say a prisoner's mother passes away. And so there's a process that he can go through and request, and he basically will end up sitting in a chaplain's office with a monitored phone call. In a private prison, there is essentially a collect phone system in place. So essentially a prisoner, now these calls are recorded, they're not unrecorded, but a prisoner can make a call to someone of their choice. Now these calls are limited in time. I don't know what the time is, 10 minutes or something. There is a time limit. And they are collect calls to whoever they're going to. But the private prison is looking at cost control as opposed to punishment. And I have experience with the state-run prisons, and my only experience with the private ones would be, let's say, talking with a prisoner who's been there. I haven't physically been in I think the nearest one is in Panama City, I think, is the nearest private prison here in Florida. But I think at least based on what's happening in Florida, I think a privately, corporate-run prison has some opportunities both for the welfare of the prisoners. I'll give you another example. If you go to the Florida State Prison, UCI, these prisons are not air conditioned. Now, in the areas where the guards, let's say the hallways and the offices, those are air conditioned. Where the prisoners are, they are not air conditioned. Now, I have some question of how much heat is there. In the wintertime, I don't think the temperature in the prisons gets much below, let's say, the mid to low 50s, and the prisoners do have extra blankets. But the state-run prisons are not a Motel 6.
I mean, both certainly sound like a punishment. And as I've said, I'm far less familiar, thankfully, with the prison situation than many other things in life. But my general point of that is, even if the private prisons aren't perfect, and I'm certain they're not, I still generally think that government simply stepping off to the side and saying, well, that's flawed, let us fix it, is just a terrible trap to fall down in so many things in life.
Charlie? I'm sorry, Jim. Thanks, Ken.
No pressure.
Adam, let's jump ahead just a little bit now and talk about the next election. Who do you see as viable candidates on the Republican side, and why?
Well, I'm incredibly biased because I live 10 houses down from Ron. And to show how not smart I am politically, I was telling you, I'm sure you were all sharing similar stories with your friends that, you got to vote for this guy for governor because he's my neighbor. Well, he was 10 houses down from me. So I was telling all my friends, you got to vote for Ron DeSantis for governor because I don't care where you are politically. If he wins, it's got to hold my home value on Zillow. And he won, and my wife was like, well, he's going to move. And I'm like, of course not. He's not going to move. It's a part-time legislature. He's going to maintain his home. And I actively run. I run in Sawgrass all the time. You can probably see me out there today. And, I run by his home all the time. I would rarely see him. I would see his wife and daughter, and I'd wave, and they wave, and they wouldn't know who I am, but a guy in the neighborhood. And maybe a week or two after he won, and there was Chevy Suburbans outside his home every day, I saw a moving van and a for sale sign, and I was so sad, and my wife was, I told you so. But obviously, Ron DeSantis is incredibly viable. If you look at all the polls, he's by far, it's a long ways out right now, but for the Republicans, by far the front runner. There's nobody close. Nikki Haley will probably run, although right now I'd say she's probably more running for vice president. Ted Cruz might run again. You might see 3 Floridians running, with Rick Scott and Rubio giving it a go as well. But with it being 3 years out, so much can happen. Who knows? But certainly as of right now, all indications are DeSantis is the guy to beat, which is just crazy for us to think that the guy who lived right there, might be our president, right? It's wild.
I assume there is no chance that Trump will run again.
I think he might run again, but I think he'll find fundraising to be far more difficult than he had found it previously. I think especially because there's a milder Trump alternative in DeSantis, it's not even like he can paint a major contrast with himself and say, well, the rest of these people are establishment hacks. That works when you're going against Romney. That doesn't work when you're going against DeSantis. So I think the most Trump could do is be a spoiler and, really damage the Republican Party in the primary, or heaven forbid, run as a third party in the general.
Yeah. And I agree. Heaven forbid. Jim, now.
Yeah, Bob, I just wanted to circle back. There was a number that I heard you say, I think, at the beginning about the number of billionaires over 200 million.
Oh, I don't think it's more than 1 or 2.
Yeah, there's actually one of them. I just want to clarify that. I thought you said 200 over 200.
No, I said there is now somebody with 200 billion. I wasn't saying there are 200, over 200. I think they're well over, I don't know if anybody has the current number of billionaires, but it's no longer that impressive to be just a billionaire.
Yeah, they've been quite successful, and notably the guy Bezos, who is over 200 billion, is obviously very successful, as are some of the other major high-tech folks, and there's a good reason for that. They're successful because of hard work, ingenuity, and stick-to-itiveness, which is the American way.
That's such a great point, because people bemoan, oh my gosh, look how much money Jeff Bezos has made. Okay, look how much Jeff Bezos has made our lives easier, especially during the pandemic when we didn't want to go walk the aisles of Target all day long and bemoan the fact that they were out of stock in something we wanted. The amount of value that Jeff Bezos offered to all of us, and I can't stand him politically, but he's offered tremendous value to people, and it's great when you can see wealth creation being, pretty consistent with his wealth increasing. And while at the same time, we've had a proliferation of billionaires and millionaires, which just sounds so horrible, we're told. In the last couple decades, the amount of people globally below the poverty line has plummeted dramatically. Globalization has really done that. We've seen massive, massive amounts of people who were, barely subsiding doing a bit better today, which is a wonderful thing that is rarely talked about. And of course, do we see this happen in the nations practicing real socialism and real communism? Did we see massive wealth creation in Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea? Of course not. But in liberalized economies that opened up to the world, that's where the wealth came, and that's where poverty has started to erode. And that's a wonderful thing that's not talked about enough.
I partially agree. I mean, I'm impressed with what China's done, but I'd hardly describe them as anything other than a communist-run liberal economy.
Well, when I talk about all the people coming out from the poverty level, some of that is in China, and a lot of that...
600 million.
Yeah, a lot of that is because what did they do? They abandoned full communism, and they at least liberalized a little bit. And it's amazing the power of free enterprise, that if you liberalize just a little bit, right away, it provides a massive benefit in wealth creation and poverty reduction. But we've also seen it in India and in Africa and other places, in South America to a degree as well.
I'll accept India, but I don't know about the rest. Charlie? Come back to that.
What are your thoughts on social justice?
Not polite. No, I mean, we had this as a question as well. And initially, the gentleman who I was going to be speaking with here today was a professor from the University of North Florida. Yes.
He spoke your question before.
Okay. And I really was looking forward to that. And I love a healthy exchange of ideas. And I think what's funny about social justice folks is they don't love a healthy exchange of ideas. It's amazing. We still use the term liberal in the year 2021 when describing people on the left. But unfortunately, liberals have largely disappeared and have been replaced by progressives. Liberals were the people who said question authority. Liberals were the people who said, I might disagree with what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. Those people are gone. Today's leftists, today's social justice warriors are progressives. Liberals descend from the Age of Enlightenment, which is when our country was founded. Conservatives could disagree with liberals on abortion and gun control and taxes and whatnot, but they were still in the same discussion. These progressives descend from the age of Marx. They don't believe the individual is supreme, which is what our country was founded on. They believe the government is supreme. They don't believe in individualism. If you listen to them talk, they bemoan individualism, which to me is terrifying. If we care about minority rights, the smallest minority in this world is the individual. So I really am terrified by the rise of progressivism, which was an ideology that briefly flourished in early 20th century America before dying off, because progressivism was from the same tree as socialism and fascism and communism. Progressives believed in eugenics. And they still supported eugenics until Hitler made it unpopular. Then all of a sudden progressives didn't like eugenics anymore. But what's terrifying is you still see progressives praise, and social justice warriors praise fans of eugenics like Margaret Sanger. I don't know if you're familiar with Margaret Sanger. She was one of the founders of Planned Parenthood. On many university campuses today, they still have a Margaret Sanger Day where they celebrate Margaret Sanger because she founded Planned Parenthood. That's well and good. Margaret Sanger believed African Americans should be sterilized and shipped off to a colony. She literally did. She wrote about it in her books. She's as horribly racist as racist could be. She should be discussed on a college campus in the same light that you might discuss Stalin and Hitler. And at least say, well, she had horrible views, but at least unlike them, she was unable to implement them. But progressives still champion this horrible woman. They'll bemoan our founding fathers, but they'll champion Margaret Sanger. That speaks to what these people believe in blind ideology versus individualism, and it speaks to how false their claims to care about race really are.
How many of you here know who Margaret Sanger is? By show of
Oh
hands.
my gosh, wow.
And how many of you here celebrate her and idolize her?
How many of you were on college campuses in the past 10 years? I assure you they do.
Sue?
I, sir, am a liberal. I am frankly terrified by your views. And I say that with all innocence and honesty.
Well, come on.
Come on.
No, I need more. Elaborate, please.
What terrifies her?
Thank you.
What terrifies me?
Right.
You've heard him. Come on. You're not willing to listen to anybody on the left. You may say you are, but what do you listen to? Fox, QAnon, News, whatever it's called? I'm sorry.
And I appreciate the frustration. And what's frustrating to me is, and this is a compliment, Adam, you're articulate and you're clear and your positions are deeply felt. When I first came to Florida, I was invited to join a group that I ultimately didn't join, and I think they were very happy about that. But in part, it was started by a discussion about Margaret Sanger. And this is only 10 years ago. I'd never heard of her. And they said, well, she, the eugenist, eugenics sponsor and eugenicist, was behind Planned Parenthood. And Planned Parenthood is something that I like today. Planned Parenthood is something one of my cousins works for. I don't think she's a baby snatching, young girl crushing person. She really believes that there's a value to Planned Parenthood. And I've asked her about the origins of Planned Parenthood and how about that Margaret Sanger passed. Margaret Sanger was not alone in believing eugenics might help solve the problems. Among the people who were with her were then Supreme Court justices, and I'm going to say I can't remember which one, then the president of Harvard, and that's not going to impress you very much, but I thought it was fairly interesting that a noted college administrator would back that belief. But it was a very brief-lived period. And it wasn't just Hitler who ended it. It ended on its own accord here, I think. I don't know. Does anybody here know about the eugenics movements of the teens and 20s? Don?
No, it still exists. Watson. It still exists.
Watson and Crick, yeah.
Right. He was finally taken out of his, the organization that he created, Cold Harbor, because he was still
Pushing
professing eugenics.
It's my knowledge,
I
it's still
mean,
happening.
and this is within the last 20 years.
I thought they were still doing forced sterilizations of some people in like the 70s in North Carolina. And also, you know, I
I'm
mentioned,
certainly doing it in other countries, third
Yeah.
world sterilizations, the Middle East.
and also Churchill was a fan of eugenics, I believe.
I wonder if we can't get to something like education and history. One of the problems that we've discussed here frequently is the presentation of American history and the limitations of it. Is there any way we can perhaps get onto that and find some interesting subjects?
I think you have.
Yeah, listen, let me pose it as a question.
Before I just wanted to respond to your comment and make one thing clear. I love hearing other views. He and I had lunch, and it was one of the most fun lunches I had in a long time because I enjoy having an open discussion of other views. And that's why when you said, you know, you didn't like what I had to say, I said, come on, because I wanted to hear, you know, disagreement. I love to agree to disagree. I love to hear opposing views. And I think we all should be that way. It's so easy in today's society to lock ourselves up in an echo chamber where we only consume news outlets that reinforce our views. We curate our Facebook news feed so it's only people we agree with. And that's terrifying. Also, to me, it's quite boring. I think it's so much more fun to have a lively and friendly discussion with somebody who has differing views. And I don't think that's a uniquely libertarian thing. I think plenty of people of all ideological beliefs, you know, feel that way. So I would know that the worst accusation I could ever get is probably that, well, you don't want to hear what other people have to say. Because I love so much hearing what other people have to say. I really do. And also, a terrible mistake made today by people of all ideological persuasions is judging the other side based on the worst 5% of that group. If you're a progressive, you assume that every right-wing Trump voter is a crazy QAnon kook. You know, and if you're a conservative, you assume that every leftist is a crazy Antifa violent thug. They're not that way. Don't judge the other side based on the worst bits of that group. Most people aren't that way.
But that's precisely what it sounds like you've done. I consider myself a progressive liberal even. And I say that just as a footnote, not as a radical. All my life people have accused me of being too liberal to be radical. I'm too open to, well, asking the question about the other side. I can't. But I want to come back to Don's suggestion that we talk about the education thing. You said one of the problems of the left today is they don't want to hear anything from the individual. They want to have only one view, and it's this, they won't allow free expression, right?
Well, the progressives are pretty openly against free speech. They seek to stifle speech. They bemoan freedom of speech.
Exactly. That's your view. How do you explain then laws by state after state after state forbidding the teaching of critical race theory in our schools?
Great question. So I don't know that it's directly related unless you're trying to point out that, well, the Republicans are banning speech too. Is that what you mean?
There seems to be a speech banning activity. Yeah.
Sure. Now, just because one side engages in one bad activity does not mean that the other side never also engages in some of that activity as well.
So you'd say it is wrong to prohibit in our educational system the teaching of history with a critical race.
So I think their approach being used to take on critical race theory is a bit of a shotgun on something that should be done with a rifle, perhaps. It's a bit of a sledgehammer for something that requires more precision.
They being the political right.
Yes, when they ban critical race theory blankly. I am terrified of what's being taught in these classrooms in the name of critical race theory or in the name of the 1619 Project and other things, where they literally teach young white children that they're evil oppressors because of their skin color, while teaching young black children that they're oppressed and the world is against them because of their skin color. That terrifies me. That's a legitimate problem that needs to be solved. Should we never teach about bad things in our country's history? Of course that's not the case. Of course we should teach an objective history. But the notion of just teaching kids that our country is a horrible place and that if they're white they're evil and if they're a minority they've been oppressed, that's a really bad problem.
I don't know about the rest. I haven't looked at the curriculum for young children I haven't seen what the teachers of critical race theory are really saying. But boy, I've never heard of anything like what you're saying.
Oh, they've linked curriculum documents showing that.
And I'll do some research on
Sure.
that. We can talk about it in a future time. I also believe it doesn't take a classroom for a black person to think he's got some problems. The talk that every parent of a black person has to have about being polite in all situations involving power, the talk that most of us as white children never had to have. You know what I'm talking about.
I disagree. I was told that I had to respect everybody. Grown,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
you know, that's. I disagree with the notion that black children have to, or the parents have to tell their children to respect authority, to respect, all kinds of authority. That I was taught that anybody else that had authority over me was like my parent, and I should not, this is as a child, not disrespect anyone.
I agree. And so was I. No, I absolutely agree. The difference between the experience that you and I have had with authority, and I've got a cute story about...
Aside, my sister was whipped in a Catholic school, for heaven's sakes. And, you know, there are bad problems everywhere.
She had sex in her Catholic school?
Yes, and, you know, and my son
I never met her. I
also,
wish I'd known where she was.
and my son also. But I don't hold that against anybody else but the person who did it.
I very much appreciate that because, as many of you were told, I was told by my parents, you know, when you're leaving this house and going out and doing whatever, you're representing this family. You don't want to, embarrass the family and whatnot. When you were going on a school field trip, you were told you're representing this school, and you wouldn't want to do anything that would besmirch the reputation of this school. Well, unquestionably, different ethnic groups have had entirely different experiences than we as individuals have had. I think boiling down our life's experience to something as simple as our skin color is unfair and outrageous. I really loved, did anybody see the film? I think it won the Best Picture a couple years ago. Green Book came out a couple years ago. What I thought was one of the most insightful things in that movie was in the third act when is it Viggo Mortensen, or I forgot who the white guy was making the case to the other guy. You grew up as an incredibly wealthy guy in like Upper West Side of Manhattan. Your life has been way easier than mine. And perhaps at that time, for an African-American person who was incredibly wealthy and attending Juilliard, life in the Upper West Side of Manhattan was much easier than a blue-collar white guy elsewhere. Now, obviously the changes if the African-American guy is going down in the South in the 1960s, it might not be so fun. But all of our life experiences are incredibly unique. And to define somebody just by their skin color, to me, is incredibly dehumanizing.
I agree with that on the other hand, but I find it difficult in an all-white audience whose experience is just, I assume, similar to mine. It's hard to say or ask anybody to say what it's like to be black, because none of us have been black.
Sure.
Many of us, I think, have been poor. Many of us have lived in situations where...
The white's fault.
It's not the white's fault that people are black.
That we are not black.
Well, nobody's suggesting that it's the white people's fault that people are black.
They're saying that we persecute the blacks because we're white. That's what's being taught now.
I mean, that is part of what critical race theory teaches these people. The notion now is that you're either a racist or an anti-racist. And they define anti-racist as only somebody who joins up with them and their social justice beliefs and wants to do all these crazy kooky things. For those of us in the middle who are, I just want to live and let live, and why can't we be buds and get a beer and maybe, disagree or whatever, they would lump us in the racist category. You're either with them and being a full social justice warrior, or they view you, and this is what they would say, as a racist. And that's crazy. It's absolutely nuts. And also, I think a hyper-focus on race relations is not a great idea. I think it was Daniel Patrick Moynihan, no big right-winger, who talked about how benign neglect was kind of the best solution towards racial issues, less focus on race. Obviously, it was Martin Luther King who said he wanted to be judged by the content of his character rather than the color of his skin. All these critical race theory people want to do is judged based on the color of your skin. Content of your character means barely anything to them. They only care about the color of your skin. I wonder how they would get along with Martin Luther King in this day and age. I also, 20 years ago, we used to hear about stereotyping being a bad thing. And it is. I mean, to stereotype groups, we, based on life experience, built some stereotypes, but I think we would all largely agree that stereotyping people, not a good thing. Well, you don't hear that term anymore from the progressives, because they're all about stereotyping. If you're a white person, I'm going to define you X, Y, and Z. If you're a black person, I'm going to define you A, B, and C. And I would say, as was said 20 years ago, stereotyping is wrong.
Charlie?
A number of organizations and businesses now are putting a statement in their, how they operate, dealing with, well, it used to be equality and inclusion. Now we've got equity. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the question of equity.
Sure. I mean, equity, of course, is one of the buzzwords of the critical race theory movement, whereas we previously focused on equality, certainly equality of opportunity, that nobody should be denied opportunity in our country based on, ethnicity or religion or gender or anything like that. Now they talk about equity, which is the government forcing things to, on their level, in their definition, be equal, or to make it an imbalance for past wrongs. It's a terrifying notion that will only create resentment and divisiveness.
Is that the same thing as a quota?
Is that?
I imagine they use quotas to achieve what they view as equity, and in things like college admissions, it becomes incredibly damaging, not merely for Caucasians, but for Asians. The Asian American community really gets hit hard by quotas a lot in the university system now.
If a company or organization does not do this, have some kind of statement like this, many are being looked at as being racial and not dealing with equality.
Yeah.
There seems to be a...
Raytheon was giving statements on diversity training and gave re-education training for their white employees. And Raytheon, a defense contractor, my gosh. I didn't know that racial justice was that essential for bombs. But it's crazy. And we're now seeing the politicization of every single bit of our society. There's no escaping politics. It's in sports. It had been in movies and everything else for years. Now it's in corporations. They're politicizing every bit of our culture. And it's something worse in politics, because I don't like politics and I want to keep politics away from me. The fact that politics now have encroached in every bit of our lives is terrifying to me.
Do you think that this whole process of politicizing, of having racial discourse, is something new? It's the teaching of critical race theory, or the concepts behind it, is something new?
Well, critical race theory is, in as much as we see it right now through things like the 1619 Project, which was for those unfamiliar, the very flawed Pulitzer Prize winning miniseries written by the New York Times, that historians and history professors of all ideologies criticized endlessly for its historical inaccuracies. And the New York Times was forced to make many amendments and many alterations to it because it was a fabrication. What they're doing now is pushing that as classroom curriculum through an organization called the Pulitzer Center, unrelated to the Pulitzer Prize. They're providing classroom content for teachers to push this 1619 Project stuff in K through 12 education. That is a relatively new thing. It's a very new thing, and it's, again, terrifying.
I'm not at all surprised that there were some mistakes found in a research project. But what was so fallacious about the 1619 Project?
Well, the general thesis of it is that America was founded and fought for our independence to preserve slavery. And that America's founding wasn't 1776 when we declared independence, it wasn't 1787 when we ratified the Constitution. They say it was 1619 when the first slave arrived. Imagine telling Northerners who didn't own slaves and who shortly later would abolish slavery entirely, that they were fighting against Britain, which did own slaves, that these Northerners were fighting to preserve slavery. They would be rather confused.
Except for some of the ancestors of my wife who owned slave ships. And they would understand absolutely what it means to preserve that business, which is what made their fortunes.
Would you suggest that a good majority or even a plurality of those fighting in the colonial military were the owners of slave ships?
No. I don't think a plurality of any military was the owner of anything. That's not how militaries are staffed, and you know that as well as I.
Exactly.
I'm talking about the people paying the rent and arguing in favor of certain positions. Now, I don't go so far as some of the 1619 people go to say that the basis of this country was slavery. And I certainly don't think that the independence movement, the whole Tea Party thing, was about slavery. But I do certainly believe that there were business people among the Cabots and lodges whose fortunes had something to do with slavery ships. And
Wouldn't that also be the same case for Britain that we fought at the time?
Oh, absolutely.
Then how the heck was it a war to preserve slavery? Let's say both sides were all in on
If you
slavery.
look at the fight against slavery in Britain, and it was a long, arduous, difficult fight, that you saw economic interests on both sides. Those Brits who were funding the plantations in the Caribbean and so on were making money from this slavery, and thus they didn't want to see it abolished. And that fight was a good fight, and I'm happy that they waged that fight, just as I'm happy we fought it too. But not to teach our children that that fight existed, that there were slaves, and that the United States wasn't. This didn't all begin in 1776. There were slaves for 200 years or 150 years before then. And what's wrong with knowing about that? What's wrong with knowing that that problem is a problem endemic to a certain economic system?
Well, I think what he's suggesting makes a great case for school choice. If you want to send your kid to a classroom where, as a white child, he's told that he's an oppressor, if you want to send your kid to a classroom with a more moderate view like that, or if you want to send your kid to a classroom where we teach that America is the greatest civilization that's ever existed, albeit flawed, and probably the least racist civilization that's ever existed, albeit imperfect, you should be able to send your kid there as well.
Jim?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Bob,
Forrest, you were over there, I've been looking that way.
well, you've been looking to the right side. Bob's trying to silence me by putting me on the left.
A little louder.
I even have my own mic. My question to this whole discussion about race, which I think is often cultural, not race, but I feel like when we talk about 1619 and we talk about whether we had Juneteenth, which is now a national holiday, I understand. I'm not sure what Juneteenth exactly, I know there should have been Emancipation Day in my mind, but I feel like it's like you guys talk, and I'm looking at Democrats, I feel like you spend your whole life running people into different sections. It's like putting heifers and bulls and calves, and you want to just isolate everybody into categories, and then you want to pick off the categories that you can get most likely to agree with you. It seems to me, though, you wasted a whole lot of time doing things that are way back. Why don't you deal with the windshield and look at the forward instead of driving your car in the rearview mirror? When you keep doing that, you end up with having a wreck, just like we've got.
Well, being related to history teachers, I don't know what to say about that for us. But I do believe that going forward is more important, and I do believe, and I agree completely, that the idea, and I hope it's not happening, that we're teaching little children to be either oppressed or oppressor, and that you're forced to be in one of those groups. I think that's absurd. But I also think that we learn enormously from studying history, and the more we learn about it, and the more accurate that knowledge is, the better for all of us. And the less we know about the past, the more likely we are, as we all know, to repeat it. Let's shift topics just for a second. Good Lord. Just as a general notion, has it been a good experience to hear somebody on the other side talking today? Golly.
You see who's clapping, who's not clapping.
Oh, I noticed that those three people have joined me not clapping. Bob.
One last note
Hold
about
this. Point the
about this
microphone.
CRT. I wonder why, if it is so great, that it was in the universities as much as 20 years ago, and has built up in the universities and other places, of course, but I happen to be at the university. And all of a sudden, about a year ago, things got loose in the world of the CRT folks, and to the surprise of many, many people in this nation, it was already embedded in all of education, every level, including young first graders and so on. We've heard stories about individuals where they teaching people that the whites are bad and the blacks are good, and things like that. That's too simplistic, I know that. But nevertheless, how did they keep that from us for so long? And it was known clearly in certain groups, even within the university, obviously in the liberal arts, and that was, as long as at the university level, then people didn't pay too much attention to it. But when it got into the public schools, then, and private schools, I might add, that we discovered something that was embedded like we never could have imagined. And now that I'll call it the fight is on, because the general public, as you see on television quite frequently, are contesting what their boards of education have done to the education systems in this country. And I'm puzzled by how they kept that so quiet for so long.
I think one of the problems in terms of the university system was that people view their alma mater the way they view their congressman. Well, all the others are bad, but mine's the good one. I volunteer for an organization where I train political activists on college campuses. I've done training in 46 states and multiple Canadian provinces, and even Mexico City. And every campus I arrive on, they tell me, Adam, you don't realize how crazy leftist it is here. And I'm like, yes, I do, because that's what they say when I land at any single campus. That's what the students say, of course. But everybody about their alma mater, they think, well, the university system's gone pretty far to the left and it's gone pretty wacky, but mine's the good one, I'll keep sending them a check. And it's for that reason that they stay funded and haven't had any reason to reform. And it's, again, as I say, it's kind of the same with your congressman. People generally think, well, Congress is terrible. The approval ratings for Congress are about as high as the approval ratings for COVID. But people think their congressman's the good one because they don't want to believe they screwed up, but they voted for the guy or gal. It's the same way with universities.
Yeah, but I'm more interested in what has happened to the public school system.
So he was...
systems in the U.S.
Yeah.
That's where it has really taught the young children.
And I think the K-12 situation is far more dangerous than the universities. Don't get me wrong, I bemoan these crazy leftist professors, but I don't think they have the influence over your children and grandchildren as many people think they do. They might take a slight leftist and radicalize them, but they're not. It's not the professors that are creating a generation of young leftists. That is happening from cultural influences, because what does your child or grandchild do when they're in college? In class, are they paying attention and hanging on every word of the professor? No, they're playing on their phone, right? That's what young people do. Well, on the phone is where the leftists are incredibly effective at getting their ideas out there. Our organization, the group I run, Accuracy in Media, spotted a few weeks ago on TikTok. Now, how many of you are on the social media site TikTok? That makes 0 of us, myself included. But it's very popular amongst young people. And one of our interns noticed that on the same day, 4 of the most influential influencers on TikTok, ranging in age between 14 and 20 years old, one of whom has 100 million followers on TikTok. You know, Sean Hannity is lucky to get 3 million viewers. 100 million followers on TikTok. These 4 kids who had never posted anything political on TikTok, all on the same day, started promoting an anti-drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge left-wing environmental organization. We looked into it. Many of these kids shared the same talent representation from the William Morris Agency in Hollywood. So probably most likely the left-wing environmental group reached out to a talent agent and said, hey, you got any kids we could pay to push our ideas? Well, I think that's diabolical, and in a way it's also kind of brilliant, because they know that these TikTok influencers hold real sway in the minds of young people. So we're sitting here getting upset about professors and whatnot, but the people who your grandchildren hang on every word of are being paid at times to push propaganda to your family members. That terrifies me.
It'll be interesting to find out more. I saw the other day about a Facebook page that, and I know Facebook is not as popular among the young kids as TikTok and some of the other programs, but it was the largest single advocate for a position. Turned out it was a Russian troll. There was never any real person behind it at all, and it had 150 million followers. How do we know that these 4 young children, 100 million followers for a young child, strikes me as pretty large. What are they putting on TikTok that attracts that?
Great question.
Do you know? I've looked at the sites.
Dance videos, makeup tutorials, silly little lighthearted content. And it's very interesting, and it speaks to, in my mind, the most effective way to have influence our society. Because since we're all allowed to stay in our own echo chamber, conservatives listen to talk radio and watch Fox and Newsmax and OAN. Left-wingers might watch CNN or MSNBC and read the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's rare that we're exposed to viewpoints that are different from ours, unfortunately, these days. The only time people break through that is when they draw you in with something other than politics. Maybe they draw you in because they're an athlete and you follow them on social media, or dance videos, or makeup tutorials. So for my money, the folks who have the greatest level of influence in society, because they speak across a broad ideological spectrum, are those who bring people in for non-political reasons.
One of the things I'd like to do, I'm sorry, John?
I would like to just make a comment relative to what Adam just said and what you asked a while ago about whether we were happy to have a speaker that is so different from so many of ourselves and his opinions. It seems to me that most of us are either stuck with MSNBC or Fox, and never the twain shall meet. And the only way any of us are going to make progress, and the system is going to make progress, is with intelligent discussions of people from opposite views. And we've had such a wonderful presentation this morning by Adam, and his responses. He's almost infectious, but not quite. And I would love for us to have him back sometime for another system. Some of us might be more prepared for Adam, because I don't think we expected to come away as impressed with what he said as some of us might have been today. And I'd just like to say thank you and Adam for this presentation, which has been thoroughly enjoyable and informative to me, and I suspect a lot of other people.
Thank you, John.
Nice job.
One of the good guys, by the way. That's very huh? That's not what you told me before. No,
He missed that.
we have about 4 minutes left. The other topics that I thought we might talk about, but I just don't think we can do it all in one session. I think we're going to have to get Adam back. And he's across the street.
Yeah, the
It's
drive's
a
not
short
bad.
walk.
Yeah.
I'll wear a tie next time. Infrastructure. How do you feel about the spending on infrastructure?
This is another situation, and we see this on all levels of government, where the government gives us a bait and switch. They say, well, if you want to fix our crumbling roads, if you're tired of the traffic on the highway, we got to spend trillions. Then you look at the actual infrastructure bill, and the current one, which is like trillions, doesn't even really include increased highway funding or anything like that. Because instead they spend on other things. And when we see this on all levels. As a longtime St. Johns County resident, it bugs me that St. Johns County, like every other local government, uses this same bait and switch. Anytime they want to raise taxes, what do they say? Well, listen, we don't increase taxes right now. We're not going to be able to have roads, not cops, nor ambulances. And then sometimes they'll mix in, we're also going to have to turn off the lights in the kids' sports fields. It's literally like, we're going to threaten you with the most important things. Well, what kind of budgeting is that? Wouldn't we presumably fund those things first, and then we could debate whether or not we fund extraneous stuff? We can debate whether or not St. Johns County needs to have an incredibly glorious, glamorous palace of a county administration building. I don't know what that's about. Do governments need to have the nicest buildings in our counties? I'm not convinced. But that's what they do. They tell you, well, unless you don't want roads, and we all generally like roads, I try to drive on them, we're going to have to spend money like crazy. But they know that if they spent that money on roads, they wouldn't be able to come back to you in a few years and say we need to do it again. And this is also, as a history buff, something where I wish we would focus on history a little bit more, because we were all taught in our schools about the Transcontinental Railroad. The government needed to step in. If not for the government, we never could have had a railroad across the country. What they don't usually mention is that the Transcontinental Railroad was pretty much bankrupt by the time it was completed. The government paid the two companies per mile of track that they laid. Now, if that was your profit motive, are you going in a straight line? Well, heck no, these guys are going all like that. One of them, I forget if it was the Central Pacific or Union Pacific, laid track all winter on the ice. Then when it thawed, they were paid to lay the track again, twice. And not surprisingly, tremendous corruption in it. People later went to jail. What you don't hear often is just 10 years later, competing with the government Transcontinental Railroad, a private businessman named James T. Hill built a private Transcontinental Railroad without using eminent domain. It was built so well that many of the bridges are still in use today. So when we talk about, well, we should be teaching an accurate depiction of history, for me, if we heard those lessons more, maybe people would be less reliant on, well, if I want a highway, we need the government. Are you sure about that? Because I'm not.
Are you also opposed to the child care provision and the early education provision in the infrastructure proposal?
Well, I don't know that I know enough about the child care provision and the early education provision, but they don't necessarily sound like a form of infrastructure.
They are part of infrastructure, and they're a very essential part of infrastructure for women in particular. Child care and early education are essential, and that is part of the whole program. I'd like to know how you feel about that. You don't know about it?
Well, again, no, not as directly familiar with that portion of the infrastructure bill. The infrastructure bill does change every day. But what I would say is, I hate how these bills get named with things that aren't necessarily directly relevant to what they're doing. The COVID relief bill, the most recent one, supposedly 93% of it didn't even go to COVID relief. We can debate and discuss child care, early childhood education. These are incredibly relevant things. But I'm just not convinced that when they talk about crumbling infrastructure, people have 6-year-olds in mind, unless the 6-year-olds are rebuilding the roads, which sounds terrible.
Just to be fair, there are many ways you can talk about infrastructure, whether it's what is the wire called? Broadband.
Okay.
Age, or roads or bridges. It's all infrastructure. Adding to infrastructure the concept of child care so that mothers can work, or early childhood education, I think is a stretch. I'll grant you completely.
I don't think anybody's ever showed up at a preschool and said, I'm here for infrastructure.
And they now are in two separate bills. And the committees who worked on those bills were separate committees, appropriately some for roads and bridges and some for education and child care support. We're out of time. I can't keep up without him. Parvez Ahmed was invited this morning, but he is not in town. He's going to come back in 2 weeks. If you're around then, maybe we can have the two of you talk. I think that'd be an interesting discussion. But I also think, I'm sorry, Don?
I hope that when he returns, he can talk at 50% of your speed. It makes it difficult for all of us to follow you. You would be much more effective if you weren't so fast and so emotional.
government wisely. And you're facing a lot of wisdom in this room.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, man.
We'll go to the guests.